Welcome to episode 2 of our series, where we journey through chapter 2 of Zafarullah Khan's Islam in the Contemporary World, a new narrative. Today, we examine the need for a new Islamic narrative, one grounded not in nostalgia, but in action, justice, and ethical renewal.
Yeah, and this chapter, it's titled Nearer to the Heart's Desire. It really kicks off with quite a challenging observation. The author, Khan, argues that Islam, which, was intended as this great mercy for humanity, has often become, well, something quite different.
Different how?
A tool sometimes for exploitation, for poverty, even violence through terror in some extreme cases. It's a tough starting point.
That's definitely a stark contrast to the ideal. So the basic idea is, despite Islam's potential, the reality on the ground often falls short.
Exactly. That's his core argument. He thinks a big part of the problem is that many Muslims are sort of stuck in the past.
Stuck how? Like just remembering history?
Kind of. Focused on historical memory, maybe past glories, but without really engaging with the principles of Islam actively in the present. And this, he says, hinders them from building, a truly Islamic modern existence. The potential's there, but it's just not being tapped into properly.
Okay, let's unpack that. So it's not just looking back, it's the failure to apply those timeless principles to today's world.
Precisely. He points specifically to a lack of genuine ijtihad.
Ijtihad, that's the independent reasoning, the intellectual effort.
Right, strenuous effort, really. And he sees this lack as a key reason why Muslims collectively have, struggled to achieve the peaceful, prosperous lives, the full potential that Islam could offer in this contemporary world.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, without that active thinking, how do you navigate complex new situations?
You really can, effectively. And because of this inertia, this lack of ijtihad, Khan issues a really powerful call to action. He says Muslims have to decide through their actions, through their deeds, how they're going to be in the world.
Not just what they believe, but what they do.
Exactly. They need to, quote, arise out of deep slumber and actively reform themselves. Otherwise, he warns, quoting the Quran, they face a divine judgment that may not be to our liking. Strong words.
Arise out of deep slumber.
Yeah.
Yeah, that really sets a tone. And to get a handle on what arising might actually look like, the author then takes us back.
Right.
Back to early Islam.
He does. He looks at how the very first Muslims responded to their challenges, drawing on these eternal principles of change and struggle. Even the chapter title, Nearer to the Heart's Desire, which he borrows from Omar Khayyam, it hints at this idea of actively reshaping, remolding the world.
Using history not just for nostalgia, but as a kind of mirror.
Yes, exactly. To ask, where do Muslims stand today? Are they really living up to that need for self-reckoning? Are they responding to the changes and challenges of their time and space like those early Muslims did?
Okay, so let's get into those historical examples. What were some of the big foundational transformations he talks about from that early period?
Well, one of the most fundamental was how Islam transformed the whole tribal structure of pre-Islamic Arabia. I mean, you have to picture it was a world dominated by clans and tribes, desert nomads often, each with their own rules, customs.
And constant conflict.
Constant conflict.
Right.
Intertribal wars over resources were just endemic. He mentions the famous Basis War. Supposedly lasted 40 years.
40 years. Over what?
Over a camel. It sounds almost unbelievable, but it gives you a sense of the scale of tribal rivalry, the blood feuds, the cycles of revenge.
Wow. So your entire life, your safety, your identity, it all revolved around your tribe?
Absolutely. Your protection, your status,
Yeah.
everything. There was this code of tribal chivalry, muruwa, courage, patience, hospitality, but also revenge. It was all tribe-centric.
And leadership.
The sheikh, the leader, was chosen by elders based on things like reputation, wisdom, leadership qualities. But his authority was tied completely to the tribe's interests. The individual, frankly, didn't count for much outside the tribal unit. And the weak? Well, they were often exploited. Women, orphans, the disabled.
A pretty harsh system. So
Yeah.
how did Islam disrupt that?
Fundamentally, it introduced a higher loyalty, a loyalty to Allah and the Prophet that transcended those tribal bloodlines. That was revolutionary.
So your first allegiance wasn't to your clan anymore?
No. It was to God and the Muslim community, the Ummah. Now, the positive aspects of moral, like courage and hospitality, they were kept, but they were broadened, extended to all Muslims, and ideally to all of humanity.
And leadership selection changed too?
Yes. The focus shifted. Piety, ability, knowledge, service, these became the important criteria, not just tribal standing or reputation.
This focus on the individual, regardless of tribe, that must have felt incredibly different.
Hugely different. Belonging to the wider Ummah, the Muslim polity, became more important than your local allegiance. And crucially, Allah became the ultimate judge. Those endless cycles of vendetta, like the Basis War, were prohibited. Faith was directed towards a code of law from Allah, the Sharia.
Establishing the rule of law, basically.
Exactly. Replacing tribal custom and revenge with divine law. It also redirected energies, encouraging perseverance, yes, but prohibiting illegal economic activities like raiding, pushing towards productive work.
Okay, so that's the first big transformation, a unifying principle overcoming these really deep, destructive divisions. What about the political landscape? What was the norm before Islam?
Well, at that time, you basically had semi-tribal systems in parts of Arabia or these large, hereditary, often despotic monarchies nearby. Think Roman and Persian empires. Common people generally had very few, if any, civil or political rights.
So power was concentrated, hereditary, and people didn't have much say.
Pretty much. But the source emphasizes that when Prophet Muhammad established the state in Medina, he laid the foundation for something completely different, a participatory system based on consent.
And the core principle driving that was shura, consultation.
Exactly, Shura. And the author stresses this wasn't just a nice suggestion. It's presented as a cardinal principle, considered obligatory by many scholars, obligatory for the ruler and for the Muslim people.
Obligatory even for the Prophet himself.
Yes, that's a key point the source makes. The Quran actually commands the Prophet to consult them, and he had divine wisdom revelation.
Right, so if it was obligatory for him,
Then it's even more crucial, more binding, for subsequent rulers who don't have that direct divine guidance. That's the argument.
and the Quran, chapter 42, it puts shura right alongside prayer and charity.
It does. It treats it as an essential quality of believers. Their affairs are run by shura among them. This tells you it's meant to be serious, effective participation, not just ceremonial.
Not just ticking a box.
No. The source even quotes a classical scholar, Ibn Atiyah, saying shura is fundamental, mandatory. And a ruler who doesn't take counsel from knowledgeable, God-conscious people, well, he should be dismissed.
Dismissed, that's strong.
Very. It shows this isn't just about the ruler asking for advice he can ignore. It's about a system where consultation has real weight, real consequences.
And how does this connect to the concept of istiklaf? Man is God's vice-gerent.
Good connection. The source explains istiklaf as God delegating authority. His authority to the people, the ummah collectively, the purpose, to maintain peace, justice, prosperity. So governance is fundamentally a trust placed in the community.
Which implies representative government.
It implies that representative governance is basically mandatory, constitutional requirement almost. Ultimate sovereignty belongs to God, sure, but its practical implementation on earth is delegated to the people. Every individual shares in that responsibility.
Okay, so that's the principle. How did it work in practice in those early days?
Well, the main mechanism mentioned is the oath of allegiance.
The oath.
It was a mutual pledge. The ruler commits to following the law, serving the people justly, and the people pledge their support and, importantly, their counsel.
And this wasn't just assumed. Rulers had to seek it.
Yes, the early caliphs actively sought public acceptance. The source mentions 2 steps: a private consultation leading to a nomination, bay'a khassa, and then a public acceptance, bay'a amma, often symbolized by a handshake. And significantly, dissent was apparently possible.
So not just rubber stamping, but genuine consent, a different model entirely from inheriting a throne.
Completely different. And crucially, this bay'a wasn't permanent or unconditional. It could be abrogated.
You mean impeachment, dismissal?
Essentially, yes, accountability was built in. The source gives those incredibly powerful quotes from the first 2 caliphs. Abu Bakr saying, basically, obey me only as long as I obey God. If I disobey him, you owe me nothing.
Wow.
And Umar saying, if I do right, help me. If I do wrong, correct me. I mean, these are foundational statements for accountable leadership, aren't they? They place clear conditions on obedience.
Absolutely. It puts the onus on the ruler to stay true to the principles, and decisions were generally made through consultation.
Yes, the source says after the Prophet, affairs were conducted by consulting Muslims and decisions were often based on the majority opinion. There was seen to be less risk of error in the collective judgment.
Were there sayings supporting this idea of following the majority?
Several are mentioned. A hadith suggesting Allah wouldn't let the whole community agree on misguidance, that the hand of Allah is over the group, follow the great mass, cling to the congregation. The idea was that collective wisdom holds a certain protection.
So the second big historical lesson seems to be that legitimate, effective Islamic governance is built on participation, consultation, accountability, and collective decision-making.
Precisely. And the impact initially was revolutionary. You had people from really humble backgrounds like Abu Huraira catapulted into positions of influence, huge empires crumbled, hereditary dynasties were replaced, at least in theory, by this rule of slaves of Allah, where even the caliph could be questioned in public. History saw real accountability.
It paints a picture of a really dynamic, progressive beginning. But as you said, the author argues this spirit. It didn't last. What went wrong?
Yeah, this is where the narrative takes a sharp turn in the chapter. The source argues that Muslims, sadly, started to tread the path of the Romans and the Persians.
The very empires they'd overcome.
Exactly. Adopting their customs, their political structures. This led to the reemergence of hereditary dynasties, Muslim monarchies. And the author is very clear. These were Muslim monarchies, perhaps, but not Islamic polities in that original participatory sense.
So that early revolutionary democratic spirit just faded.
It died out relatively soon, according to the source. Instead of adapting Islamic principles to build unique political structures, they kind of reverted to the old models they'd initially replaced.
And a different political theory took hold.
A very different and problematic one. Kings started declaring themselves shadows of God on earth, zillullah, claiming divine appointment and almost sacred, untouchable authority.
That sounds completely counter to the idea of the ruler being accountable to the people and God's law.
It is, and the source makes a really strong and quite critical point here, that tragically, many influential Muslim scholars actually gave unconditional support to this very un-Islamic concept.
Why would they do that?
Often, the justification mentioned is maintaining public order, avoiding chaos. But the result was that the focus shifted entirely. Instead of emphasizing the rights and role of the people, the discussion became all about the emir, the ruler. Obedience to him became binding, almost absolute.
And shura, consultation.
It became merely advisory, ceremonial perhaps. The ruler wasn't bound by the counsel given, it lost its teeth completely.
A total reversal from those early principles of accountability and participation we just talked about.
A complete reversal. And the source argues this flawed and un-Islamic political doctrine had really serious, damaging repercussions on both religious and political life.
Does it give examples?
It does. One is from Mughal India, where hundreds of scholars apparently drafted a document giving Emperor Akbar sweeping temporal and religious powers, making obedience to him binding. This paved the way for his controversial Dini Allahi.
But not everyone agreed.
No, thankfully. Sheikh Ahmad Sirhandi strongly repudiated it, but the source points out most scholars sided with the emperor. It also mentions scholars siding with different claimants to the throne later, like Darashikoh versus Aurangzeb, showing how intertwined religious authority became with supporting ruling power.
And the other consequence was tyranny.
Yes, absolute monarchy opened the door to political repression. The source gives this horrifying example of an Indian ruler ordering a citizen trampled to death by an elephant, apparently just for causing some offense. And when an imam recited a relevant Quranic verse, Surah Fil, about elephants, he met the same fate.
It's just chilling. It shows how completely unaccountable power can become.
Exactly. It underscores how far things had drifted from Umar's, correct me if I'm wrong, the poet Iqbal's quote is mentioned here too about monarchy giving rise to symptoms of madness and calling figures like Timur and Changes gods scalpels.
Suggesting they were almost a divine consequence for this deviation.
That seems to be the implication, yeah.
Yeah.
A harsh judgment on where things ended up.
So this decline wasn't just in politics. The author sees this erosion of early principles happening elsewhere, too.
Oh, absolutely. Across the board, really. Take freedom and human dignity, for instance. Islam emerged in a world where slavery, human bondage, was just normal, widespread. The source argues forcefully that Islam didn't just accept or regulate slavery. It denounced it, fought against it in all its forms.
All forms, not just physical slavery.
Right. Physical, yes, but also intellectual servitude, social bondage. It aimed to establish freedom as the natural, God-given state. The author highlights that incredibly powerful statement by Hazrat Umar to the governor whose son had struck an Egyptian commoner. Since when did you enslave the people, though they were born from their mothers in freedom?
That's a profound statement. Born free.
It is. And the source contrasts it interestingly with Rousseau's famous line, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. Rousseau stated a fact, a condition. Umar denounced the act of enslavement and declared the inherent freedom. It's proactive.
That's a really key difference. An assertion of rights.
Yes. And this struggle was against all forms of enslavement. Even boasting about your noble lineage was seen as a kind of social enslavement. There's another powerful quote mentioned from Rabi bin Amir, a Muslim envoy before a major battle, saying essentially, Allah sent us to deliver people from worshiping created things to worshiping the Creator, for the narrowness of this world to its vastness, from the oppression of other systems to the justice of Islam.
So the core idea is that true submission to God frees you from all other forms of submission or slavery.
Exactly, that's the theological underpinning. Iqbal has a famous couplet about this, how one prostration to God frees humankind from needing to bow down 1,000 times before idols or powerful men.
So the nugget here, Islam's foundational principle is inherent human freedom and dignity. People are born free.
That's the ideal presented, but mirroring the political decline, the source laments that later Muslim rulers and, crucially, scholars often disregarded this. Well, the practice of enslaving subjects increased both physically and intellectually. The slave trade grew, concubinage became more common, and perhaps most worryingly, the source points out that some scholars, in their books of fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, started discussing male and female slaves in ways that seem to justify captivity, sometimes in ways the author feels contradict the clear spirit of the Quran and Sunnah.
So the legal framework itself started to accommodate practices that went against the original principle.
That's the critique. The clear teachings on freedom and dignity were often ignored. And those who did raise their voices against repression and injustice, well, they often faced prison or death. Imam Hussein, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Ahmad Sirhandi, again, historical examples are cited of those who suffered for challenging power.
Another major area the author covers is justice and equity. What was the situation like before Islam, according to the source?
It describes a state of widespread zulm injustice, oppression in pretty much every sphere. Social exploitation, class differences, political tyranny based on power or origin, economic extortion, and inequality driven by greed.
So injustice was the norm.
Largely, yes. And Islam's response, the source argues, was an unequivocal condemnation of all forms of zulm and a declaration and upholding of adl justice and ihsan equity or goodness as absolutely fundamental.
The source uses those simple, powerful definitions for adl and zulm, right?
It does. Zulm is to put a thing in a wrong place, and adl is to put a thing in its right place. Deceptively simple, but they cover everything: social, political, economic, personal. It shows how central justice was.
And ihsan is presented as something even beyond strict justice.
Yes. Adl is getting what is due, your rights. Ihsan is about beauty, goodness, excellence, doing more than what is strictly required by law. It's about balancing the certainty of law with fairness, compassion, mitigating harshness, going the extra mile.
Like tempering justice with mercy.
Kind of, yeah. The Quran itself commands both. Allah commands you justice, adl, and equity as well. They go together. And the source paints a picture of that early society founded in Arabia as being built on these principles: leadership based on merit, an economy based on hard work and compassion, an egalitarian social order, a balance between rights and duties, the individual and the collective.
But again, this ideal eroded.
Yes, the same pattern. The source says vicious political thinking and evil ambitions began to prevail. Zulm, political, social, economic, reemerged. And here again, the author makes a very pointed critique of the role some scholars played. He argues that Muslim kings often acquired the services of ulema to justify or rationalize the oppression, zulm, being inflicted on the masses.
So instead of speaking truth to power, they helped legitimize injustice.
That's the heavy accusation, that unfortunately many influential scholars throughout history did not raise their voices against this zulm, but instead tried to find a justification for it.
Does it give examples of this justification?
It mentions, quite startlingly, finding entire chapters in famous fiqh books dedicated to explaining how to legally evade zakat and other obligatory taxes specifically meant to ensure social justice and help the poor.
Wow. Finding loopholes in divine commands.
Exactly. The source compares these rationalizations to the pretexts and evading tactics of the Bani Israel mentioned in the Quran. The conclusion is pretty stark. Muslims largely forgot the noble lessons of al and ihsan and increasingly adopted zulm.
So the nugget. Justice and equity are non-negotiable foundations, and their abandonment, sometimes even aided by intellectual justification, leads straight to decay.
That sums it up well.
What about fundamental human rights more broadly?
Yeah.
Does the author see Islam as pioneering in this area?
Very much so. While acknowledging traces in earlier systems like Roman law, the source argues Islam was arguably the first religion to champion the rights of the citizens in a comprehensive way. And crucially, it declared these rights as inherent, intrinsic, because humanity is God's best and noblest creation, the crown of creations, not rights granted by kings or states that could be taken away.
They come from God, essentially.
Yes. Based on the inherent dignity God bestowed on humanity, the source quotes verses like, "We have honored the sons of Adam, we created man in the best mold," and the story of Adam being made vicegerent with angels bowing to him. The message is, people are not inferior creatures. They have inherent worth.
So these are universal rights?
Universal fundamental rights to be respected under all circumstances within an Islamic state or outside it, in peace and in war.
Can you give some examples listed in the source?
Sure, it covers a lot. The absolute sacredness of human life, killing one innocent soul, is like killing all mankind.
That's a powerful statement.
Isn't it? Then, security of life and property, the Prophet's famous last address emphasized this. Protection of honor, the Quran forbids derision, defamation, spying, backbiting. Privacy of the home, don't enter without permission.
These sound remarkably modern.
They do. Also, the right to protest tyranny specifically mentioned in the Quran for those who are wronged. Freedom of conscience and conviction, no coercion in faith, is the bedrock principle.
No forced conversions.
Absolutely not. The right to basic necessities, the Quran states the needy have a due share in the wealth of others. Equality before the law.
You mentioned the Prophet's example with the noblewoman thief earlier.
Exactly. That illustrates it perfectly. And finally, the right to participate in state affairs, which links back to Shura.
And the farewell sermon itself is presented as a kind of early human rights charter.
Yes, the source calls it a clear and concise charter of human rights, arguing Muslims can really assert that the modern human rights movement has deep roots here.
What are some key points from that sermon mentioned?
Oh, loads. Equality based purely on piety, not race or lineage, quoting the Quran. Most honored is the most God-fearing. No Arab superiority over non-Arab or white over black. Muslim brotherhood. Abolishing old blood feuds and claims of privilege from the era of ignorance. Sacredness of life, property honor again. Hurting no one. Taking property only if given freely. Returning trusts. Forbidding usury, neither inflicting nor suffering inequity.
It's incredibly comprehensive.
It really is. Women's rights are explicitly mentioned, treating them kindly, recognizing their rights to provision, viewing them as partners, warning against unchastity, rights regarding children and inheritance, paying zakat, repaying debts, returning borrowed items, individual responsibility for crime, no blaming family members.
Even servants' rights.
Yes. Feed and clothe them as you would yourselves, and obey the appointed leader, even if he's a former slave, as long as he follows God's book. A warning against religious extremism, too.
It covers so much ground. What about education?
The source highlights the Prophet's pragmatic approach, freeing prisoners of war from the Battle of Badr if they taught Muslims to read and write, not fearing knowledge, even from non-Muslims.
And treatment of non-Muslims living under Muslim rule.
The dhimmi. Guaranteed freedom to practice their religion, treated justly. The source includes strong warnings from the Prophet against mistreating them, saying whoever is cruel to a non-Muslim minority, the Prophet himself would complain against that person on Judgment Day. Even a Western historian, Will Durant, is quoted observing the tolerance of early Muslim rule.
What about economic rights?
Also covered. The example of Abu Zar Ghafari sharing his resources is cited, linked to the Quranic principle of giving away what is beyond your needs. And Hazrat Umar's famous statement about being accountable if even a dog died hungry on the banks of the Euphrates, that's presented as a declaration of Islamic economic and political philosophy. The state's responsibility.
A responsibility for everyone's basic welfare.
Yes, and especially the vulnerable. The Prophet's statement, "I am supporter and guardian of the person who has no supporter and guardian," is seen as defining state policy to protect the destitute, orphans, minors, widows.
So the big picture nugget here is that Islam established a really broad, comprehensive framework of universal human rights, assigning the state a key role in protecting them, and this might have influenced later rights movements globally.
That's definitely the argument the source puts forward, a vision of a society grounded in dignity, justice, and rights for all. But again, the caveat is that this vision was often lost or ignored in later history.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit to the intellectual side. What was Islam's approach to knowledge and learning early on?
Well, the source stresses that Islam placed an incredibly high value on knowledge right from the very beginning. Think about the Quranic story of Adam.
Being taught the names of things.
Exactly. Before the angels, who were busy glorifying God. This story is interpreted as showing knowledge, particularly knowledge of the natural world, as being superior even to acts of worship, like prayer alone. It's essential for humanity's role as God's vicegerent.
Knowledge of things, so, like science, not just theology.
Precisely. Natural physical sciences. And then, of course, the very first revelation itself starts with read, Ikra,
Read, in the name of your Lord who created.
who taught by the pen, taught man that which he knew not. The source argues these verses directly stimulate a scientific outlook, a quest for knowledge, promoting research, including in physical sciences. It even links spiritual knowledge of God to scientific evidence, like biology in the mention of creation from an embryo.
And taught by the pen implies.
Developing knowledge, promoting it, transferring it across generations, it's foundational for learning and science.
So this wasn't just about religious texts, but actively engaging with the world through observation and learning.
Absolutely. The Quran itself repeatedly urges people, don't you see, don't you reflect, don't you ponder on the signs in the universe. The source argues this motivated early Muslims to focus on empirical methods, observation, reflection, experimentation, leading to advances in physical and biological sciences.
Did they engage with existing knowledge from other cultures, like the Greeks?
They absolutely did, but it wasn't blind acceptance. They didn't just declare Greek philosophy kufr or disbelief. They studied it, translated it, interpreted it. Figures like Al-Farabi became known as the second teacher after Aristotle, but they also critically examined it. Imam Ghazali famously wrote The Incoherence of the Philosophers, critiquing aspects of Greek thought. Then Ibn Rushd wrote The Incoherence of the Incoherence, defending philosophy. Imam and Taymiyyah also engaged deeply.
So a real intellectual engagement, absorbing, debating, critiquing.
Yes, a systematic study and, importantly, transfer of knowledge. The source suggests this critical synthesis and transmission to the West significantly influenced European thought, Platonic idealism, challenged by Arab empiricism, Aristotelian logic refined, maybe even echoes of Ghazali and Kant.
It sounds like a golden age of intellectual activity and scientific progress.
It certainly was, for a time. The source explicitly credits early Muslim scientists, recognized even by Western historians for foundational work. Ibn al-Haytham in optics and physics, al-Khwarizmi in algebra and arithmetic, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, in medicine, al-Zahrawi, al-Bukhasis in surgery.
All based on observation and experimentation.
Yes, observation, experimentation, systematization. And these early scholars, the source notes, had a holistic view. They studied humanity and the universe, believing in the unity of matter and spirit. They didn't artificially divide life into this world and the hereafter in the way that happened later. Old versus new wasn't the issue. Knowledge was knowledge. They developed technology from science.
Okay, the inevitable question then. What happened? Why the decline from these intellectual heights?
Yes. The source uses stark language here. Muslims fell into a deep intellectual slumber. They basically just kept teaching the same old syllabi for centuries.
Became complacent.
Complacent, indifferent, unresponsive to the new sciences and philosophies emerging from the European Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution. They just weren't engaging anymore.
So they stopped that active process of observation, questioning, critical thinking.
It seems so. The source argues they started making these unhelpful divisions, spiritual versus temporal life. Material progress somehow became viewed as suspect, maybe even anti-Islamic by some. Natural sciences were neglected. They got bogged down in what the author calls futile theological debates, often under lingering Greek philosophical influence, or lost in the intoxication of false mysticism, focusing purely on intuition and esoteric knowledge at the expense of the empirical approach the Quran encouraged.
So instead of tackling new challenges or pushing the boundaries of knowledge,
they got stuck in theological hair-splitting, scholasticism. They weren't doing the serious intellectual work needed for later challenges or for advancing human knowledge generally.
and the world moved on without them.
Exactly. As the source puts it quite bluntly, time did not wait for them. And so they lag behind. The Omar Khayyam quote feels particularly relevant here again, that desire to remold it nearer to the heart's desire. Well, they lost the intellectual tools, the dynamism needed for that kind of a remolding.
So the final historical nugget: active intellectual engagement, embracing empirical inquiry, critical thinking, these are vital Islamic principles, and neglecting them leads inevitably to stagnation and decline.
That captures the essence of it, yes.
Okay, so bringing all these historical threads, the transformation, the declines, back to the author's main point for today. How does this history inform his call for a new narrative?
Well, all these examples, the shift from tribalism to a unified community, from monarchy to consultation, from bondage towards freedom, from pervasive injustice towards adl and ihsan, from ignorance to intellectual pursuit, they serve a purpose. They demonstrate that when Muslims did actively understand and apply Islam's core principles, using that critical intellectual effort, ijtihad, they achieved remarkable things. They created dynamic, progressive societies striving for justice.
So the history isn't just a nostalgic look back, it's proof of concept almost. Proof that the capacity for positive transformation is inherent within Islam.
Exactly. That's the crucial takeaway. The author isn't saying, let's perfectly recreate the 7th century. He's saying, look, the principles and the capacity for renewal, for progress, for justice are there. History shows us they work when applied dynamically.
So arising from deep slumber, as he put it, means getting beyond just dwelling on past glories.
Yes. It means recognizing that venerating the past isn't enough. It demands re-engagement with the world, right now, today. Through action, through striving for justice, through ethical renewal, through that critical thinking and intellectual effort ijtihad. It's about applying those foundational principles, consultation, justice, freedom, knowledge, to our complex contemporary challenges.
Using that inherent capacity, shown in history, to actively remold the present and the future.
Precisely, to build something relevant, just, and dynamic now, not just for Muslims, the author implies, but potentially offering something positive for all of humanity, just as those early transformations did.
It really shifts the focus from passively remembering history to actively making history based on enduring principles.
That's the heart of the call for a new narrative, moving from nostalgia to action, from imitation to innovation grounded in principle.
It certainly gives us a lot to think about. And perhaps a final thought for you, the listener. Given these powerful historical examples of how early Muslims actively sought to remold their world based on core Islamic principles like justice, consultation, and freedom, what specific actions or efforts might be needed today to build a future nearer to the heart's desire, not just for Muslims, but for all of humanity? What stands out most to you from this deep dive into Islam's potential and its challenges?